how is Canada preparing for Trump's return to the White House? Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly joins me now. Minister, it's good to speak to you. Thanks for being here.
Good to speak to you, David, also. Good to see that you're in Washington and I'm in Ottawa.
Well, thank you for taking the time on a significant day, because it sounds like you're going to have some difficult times ahead. Analysts are calling what we're about to potentially see under a Trump administration as a big squeeze. A lot of pressure on Canada on trade, on immigration and military spending. How prepared is your government on this?
We are. First and foremost, we've been following the race. We knew it was a tight race, and we had a plan for both a Harris win, a Trump win. And so now we're going to make sure that we connect first and develop and nurture the relationship we already had. So that's our goal, because we know that this period right now is important to make sure that we are able to have good relationships and good connections with the new administration. So we've done the transition between Obama to Trump. We've done the transition between also Trump to Biden, and now, of course, we're doing the transition between Biden and Trump.
Well, you're going to need those relationships and connections, because the stakes are enormous, Minister. I mean, you've been talking to Trump's circle about his plan to impose anywhere from 10 to 20% tariffs on anything coming into the country. Do you have any assurances yet on whether Canada or Mexico, the NAFTA partners, can get exemptions from these tariffs?
Well, first, as I was saying, we know the Trump team. We've negotiated a new NAFTA with them. And so, we know that we have leverages, we have strengths, and at the same time, there are common grounds on which we can work on. Of course, you were in Washington. We all stayed up very late last night. It's been, I'm convinced, a very short night for President-elect Trump, and also for his supporters and his campaign. So these connections are being, of course, reactivated as we speak. And also, just another point that is really important, David, is I've been in contact with many, many foreign ministers from around the world today, because if there's a country on earth that really understands the U.S. and understands also the Trump administration, because the Trudeau government was in power between 2016 and 2020, it's actually Canada and this government. And so lots of people are reaching out to us.
But Minister, these tariffs, I mean, these are estimated to knock at least half a point off of the country's GDP. That's enough to put the economy into recession. So do you have any clarity on whether or not Canada is exempted from this, or whether it's going to have to deal with this and maybe retaliate with tariffs of its own?
David, I don't want to speculate. We've just been, the results were given at 4 o'clock this morning. The president was talking to the press and to his supporters. So we're around 12 hours after just basically that historic speech. It's an historic election. We know that at least 35 states have as their #1 market to export Canada. We know also that there are many jobs on both sides of the border that depend on our two countries. And so we'll be ready, and we are ready.
Right. But this is a promise that's been around for a while in this campaign, so it sounds like you don't have the clarity yet. You're still waiting to find out whether or not Canada is exempted. Is that a clear assessment of where things are right now?
I don't think anybody watching us will think that, of course, the decisions have been taken over the past 12 hours. There's no Secretary of Treasury, there's no Secretary of State. Let's all make sure that we breathe and we can address what we'll be working on as a country. But where I think that there's really common grounds is more than ever, as geopolitics has changed a lot in the past 3 years, which was very different between the first Trump administration between 2016 and 2020, is that we are increasing our investments in defense. We need to make sure that we protect North America. And that's why we've been focusing on a part of the world that is really, really important to the Americans and really, really important to us, which is the Arctic, which includes, of course, the Canadian Arctic. And I've been working on a new Arctic foreign policy, which I'll be launching soon. We have a new defense policy that triples the budget in terms of defense and really focuses on the Arctic. And so based on that, I think there will be lots of people interested in the new Trump administration to hear what we're doing, because one thing is clear is administrations can change, but our geography won't, and so we'll work on that.
Right. Okay, I do want to touch a little bit more on defense spending in a second, but first I want to ask you about something that the former U.S. ambassador to Canada, Kelly Craft, said last night when she spoke to my colleagues Susan Bonner and Catherine Cullen on the CBC Radio election special. And it was about the immigration plans and the border plans inside the U.S. and the impact on Canada. Just have a listen to this.
So where do you think the illegal immigrants are going to flee to when our southern border is shut down, the northern border? So Canada needs to be prepared.
So, Minister, that's a pretty stark warning that the mass deportation policies that Trump was elected on could potentially send people north, or it could reroute fentanyl trafficking and other things coming from the southern border into Canada. What do you make of this warning?
Well, when it comes to migration, I think that people clearly want us to have a strong system. And they want us also to make sure that people are confident that they trust our immigration system. And that's why we decided to lower basically the targets, the immigration targets, by 20%. I think that was a really important decision. Actually, also that was highlighted by Trump himself while he was campaigning. At the same time...
But this sounds, Minister, like it could be a surge like Roxham Road, but on a much larger scale, right?
So
I take the ambassador's words as that.
I hear you. So you're referring to Roxham Road. It was myself and the former Minister of Immigration and, of course, the Prime Minister that work on a deal to make sure that we would have a renewed safe third country agreement, which was we were able through that agreement with the U.S. to close the Roxham Road and address this issue. And of course, we'll work with the administration. But we need to bear in mind that, yes, indeed, President-elect Trump has said that migration was a key priority for him. And so therefore, we are ready.
But how are you ready, though? If, for example, all the Haitians who are still there in temporary protected status and during Trump 1 presidency, just the talk of it had people fleeing for the Canadian border. Now he's talking about mass deportations, potentially millions of people. That's going to be an added incentive for people to flee for safety, and they're unlikely to head towards Mexico. I mean, how do you deal with this potential movement of desperate humans if this comes to pass?
So, David, of course, I won't give you the entire plan right now as you're asking me the question, because I think we need to have the first conversations with the Trump administration. We need to understand their concerns. We need to understand their plan, of course, and we will work through the CBSA, which is in charge of our border protection. We'll make sure that indeed this northern border, which has been extremely effective and extremely well guarded because it's the longest and safest border in the world, stays the same. And so we have that in common with the Americans, that we believe that border protection is important. Right. And so, therefore, we'll have these conversations. They may be tough conversations, but I'm never shy of having tough conversations. And I think that Americans expect us to have tough conversations with them, too. That's diplomacy, and that's why diplomacy was actually invented, David.
No, I appreciate that, and I suspect you'll have some tough conversations on defense. As you mentioned, there is a renewed focus on the Arctic. There is a plan to increase Canada's defense spending, though it still doesn't get to 2% at the end of the target, and we know how frustrated Donald Trump was about that issue when he was president before. When I was in Ottawa last week, I spoke with some diplomats from other NATO countries, and they were deeply worried about what a Trump victory would mean for the alliance. People aren't at 2%. There's a distaste for troop deployments overseas, even if it is just in Europe. I mean, where do you think this goes in terms of the security posture of Europe and what this could mean for Ukraine?
Again, I think that the world has changed a lot since the first Trump administration mandate between 2016 and 2020. And I think the alliance is stronger than ever, and that we've seen massive investments in defense budget across the alliance, including us. I think for a long time, indeed, Canada could have invested more in defense. And, you know, under the Harper government, we got lower than 1% of GDP, which was completely unacceptable. Now we're tripling the budget. We need to make sure also that these investments are not just words that I'm telling and that people are hearing, but concretely that these investments are made so we can hire new people to serve as part of our Canadian Armed Forces that are doing fantastic work, that we can invest in new equipment. We're buying 88 new F-35s. This investment is creating jobs here at home and also on the other side of the border in the U.S. Concretely speaking, we're investing also in new icebreakers. Canada is the country that U.S. relies upon to develop also all the icebreakers capacity, because the U.S. doesn't have enough capacity when it comes to the icebreakers. And of course, we're thinking about the Arctic and our north, and we know Russia is a neighbor and is allowing China to come into our waters. So all that to say, there's definitely a conversation to have about defense. I think as foreign minister, for me, investing in defense is fundamental. Maybe not all foreign ministers in the past have believed that, but I'm really hawkish on this issue. I really, really think that we need to take the protection of our sovereignty and territorial integrity extremely seriously, and we need to be a partner to the U.S., a reliable one, and we will be. And so that's why we've taken historic decisions in terms of investment in our defense.
Good. I have one last question about politics just to ask you, Minister.
Yeah.
Often in question period and in your online materials that come from the Liberal Party, you compare Poilievre and his Conservatives to Donald Trump, to the MAGA movement. Do you have to knock that off now that Donald Trump is going to be in the White House and MAGA may control every level of the U.S. government? You're relying on relationships. Can you keep using that as a weapon politically against the opposition?
Well, so I think that the Canadians know the Liberal Party and our values. But I think that what we need to reckon is something that I'm seeing across the world, David, and I'm being very frank with our viewers right now. I know that people are angry. I know there's frustration. We're all frustrated when we go and buy our groceries. And, you know, I was looking at just buying a pound of butter over the weekend. It's nearly $9 in Montreal. So I can understand that. There's a reason why people want us to make sure that we have their back. And we need to give people power back. We need to make sure that we give them ways that they can make sure that they can have ends meet. And so we're doing so through the dental care program. We're doing so through the pharmacare program. We're doing so through the child care program. We have a very different way of supporting Canadians than the state of America has with supporting the U.S.
But the MAGA comparisons, Minister, using Trump as a weapon against Mr. Poilievre, doesn't that need to stop now, given what's happened here in the United States?
I'll let my party take decisions on that. I'll deal with the relationship with the U.S. But what I can tell you, though, is that we absolutely need to make sure that we understand that people around the world are sending messages to governments, the governments in place. And so that's why I'm convinced that we will have a strong economic plan coming in this FES, this fall economic statement, and also with the budget, because people need support. And we've been there since 2015 and will continue to be there for them.
No, I don't think there's any doubt people are sending a message to their governments in these elections. Minister Mélanie Joly, Minister of Foreign Affairs, thank you so much for your time today.
It's a pleasure. Enjoy Washington. Thank you.
Thank you.
I look forward to working with President Trump once again to strengthen North American economic opportunities for the middle class.
My job is always to find common ground with the U.S. and also defend our interests, and that's what I'll do.
Our interests are aligned with the U.S. in making sure that we have a northern border that is secure and that has a managed flow of trade and migrants, and that'll continue.
I want to say with utter sincerity and conviction to Canadians that Canada will be absolutely fine.
The American people had their election last night. The people are never wrong. We look forward to working with the new administration.
The good thing for Canadians is we're ready. Actually, I was already texting folks in the United States and they're responding. So this is good.
And now, a newly elected American president wants to take our jobs for Americans. We understand why Donald Trump wants to take Canadian jobs, but why does this Prime Minister want to help him?
Today's a day to get ready to fight, to protect Canada, to protect our jobs, to protect our values.
Okay, back home in Ottawa, reaction to Donald Trump's election victory, a win that carries all sorts of implications for Canada and the world. What should Canadians expect from a second Trump presidency? We're going to talk about that with the Power Panel. Amanda Alvaro is a former Liberal Party communication strategist. Ginny Roth is a former Conservative campaign strategist. Jordan Leichnitz is a former NDP strategist. And Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor of the Hill Times. It's good to see you all. Amanda, let's start with you. There's some talk there from cabinet ministers about finding common ground with the Trump administration. Where would that common ground be, do you think?
Well, I mean, listen, this is a government who's worked with the Trump administration previously, who was able to pass major agreements with this administration. So there's a history and a track record of being able to do that. And I think that they can borrow from that history, despite how disappointing this outcome is for many Canadians who are watching and hoping for a different outcome. I think it's really important. And you heard that in Chrystia Freeland's comments when, it was like she was trying to, both sympathize with how people were feeling, but also reassure them when she said it's going to be fine. Because I think that there's a sense of this side of the border feeling the concerns around the tariffs, which she talked about, concerns around security, certainly concerns around women's reproductive rights south of the border and how those messages could trickle north. And I think that anxiety, which is brewing in Canadians, is something that a lot of ministers were trying to reassure and appease today. And I think that that's really the right message.
Ginny, there's going to be a lot of pressure on defense spending. There is the concern of exactly how the tariffs will be implemented and used if Donald Trump should go ahead with this. And then there's the concerns about the mass deportation policies he got elected on that could send some migrants north, heading towards the Canadian border. Where do you think this goes for the Trudeau government?
Yeah, I think it's a tough job, and it requires a tough leader in Canada. And I don't think Canadians feel like the leader we have today is tough enough to handle some of the really difficult negotiations, whether it's reopening USMCA and trade in general, tariffs on all goods potentially for Canada, our biggest export country being the U.S., whether it's NATO spending, all of the above. I mean, Canadians are anxious. I don't think they're anxious about Trump. I think they're anxious because Canada's not in a good spot. Our economy is kind of hanging by a thread. The cost of living issue has not been solved. And now we've got a new variable as someone who can be rather unpredictable. And so I think most Canadians are feeling like change can't come soon enough here so that we can get to work trying to negotiate toughly and get good results.
Rather unpredictable, maybe the understatement of the day, Ginny. Jordan, Jordan, what are your thoughts on what has landed on the Prime Minister's lap with a tough election year looming?
An unenviable task. I think that there's obviously some huge lessons here for the Liberals and for the Prime Minister about what happens when you are running in a change election, when you have an incumbent who is not popular, and in this case, Vice President Harris was not able necessarily to distance herself from Biden in the way that she needed to. And the results really speak for themselves. It was not really close. And I think that at the end of the day, the Trump campaign, for all its absolute erraticness, and to be really clear, he's a strong man, and that's who the American electorate have hired for the job here. But it was centered around one really important question. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And the answer was no for most voters. And so I think that there's a lot of profound lessons here for progressives on both sides of the border about the need to have an economic message that resonates at the household level. And that's something that all parties here should be thinking about as well.
Sherelle, how do you think the government responds to this? I mean, do we see cabinet changes? Do we see charm offenses? Do we see, a committee focused on this like they did before at the NAFTA Council? Well, what do you think the Trudeau government does to respond to what happened here?
Well, I should hope that kind of all options are on the table. The Trudeau government has already kind of put forward their Team Canada team to go forward with Minister Ng and the ambassador and the innovation minister and all people like that to kind of go and knock doors and go and really push the Biden administration. I found it really interesting listening to some of the reactions today that there didn't really seem to be a cohesive message coming out. I found that listening to somebody like Francois Philippe Champagne, the innovation minister, saying, you know what, I'm texting people and I'm getting responses. I'm talking to people on Trump's team and, you know, it's positive that we want to work together. And then you have someone like the foreign minister, Mélanie Joly, when you were talking to her earlier, she seemed really reticent to even acknowledge that what Donald Trump has said during the campaign about the tariffs. She kept saying, oh, this is, you know, he's only been elected, it's been 12 hours. Well, no, it hasn't been 12 hours. He's not a man who he generally pulls back on the things that he says he intends to do. So yes, she said, well, we're not going to give you the whole plan right here, right now. But it does seem odd that with all of this preparation that they say that they've been doing, that they haven't been able to come out kind of with a more full-throated approach saying, hey, we've been planning for this, we've been preparing for this, and here's what we're going to be doing going forward.
Yeah, Amanda, it's unclear to me how deep into the Trump inner circle the Team Canada offensive was able to penetrate. I know they've spoken to governors and mayors and industry associations who they hope will carry the message for them. But I couldn't tell from my conversation with Minister Joly whether they just don't know how the tariff would apply to Canada and Mexico as NAFTA partners, or if they don't want to say and they're trying to just project no sense of panic but a calm approach to things. I mean, how do you read things?
Yeah, that was for sure my read today, and reiterating what I said earlier, I do think that was the idea, was to reassure and also to remind Canadians that this is a government who has successfully negotiated with the Trump administration previously. This is the only government that has successfully negotiated with the Trump administration. So there are ties there and there are relationships there, and you can certainly bet on the fact that they're going to be leveraging every one of those relationships into Trump's inner circle in order to ensure that trade relationship remains as fruitful for Canada as possible. I also thought what was interesting today was Poilievre's approach, which was a little bit of the beating of the chest approach. And I think Ginny used the word, tough leadership. Trump is not a leader who has generally responded favorably to demands or to a tough approach. I think he's much more favorable to the charm offensive. He's much more favorable to a cooperative inner circle, sort of lend an olive branch, put a hand out and a handshake. So I thought that was an interesting take from Poilievre today to come out running, except that perhaps he's trying to distance himself from those, obvious Trump comparisons that certainly the Liberals will make and others will make as we head into, what will be the next federal Canadian election.
I asked Mélanie just to stay with you for a second a minute. Do you think they can keep doing that? Because he's in the White House now. He's got the Senate. He's probably going to have Congress, and he's got the court. I mean, boy, you really don't want to wave a red flag in front of that bull.
True. But I also think that, advantage one may be if Trump does the crazy that we expect him to do in the first few months of his presidency. Certainly no leader wants to be compared to that. And I think that there are fears and there are anxieties, and they are not just about what's happening on the ground here. They certainly are about Trump's leadership and what that could look like. And I think if people start to panic or feel that things that are happening in the States could move northbound, that could pose a threat and a problem to Poilievre's Conservatives.
Okay, Ginny, your thoughts on whether the MAGA attacks on Mr. Poilievre and the Conservatives have to go away, and his approach to this today, which Amanda described as beating his chest. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, as you pointed out, David, it's very difficult for the Liberals to simultaneously calm everyone down, say this is no big deal, everything with Trump is going to be fine, but also he's crazy, and so is Pierre Poilievre. Like, you can't have it both ways, and they can't. I think they're trying to pick a lane and stick to it. There'll be a lot of pressure from Jagmeet Singh on their relationship. I think we saw Jagmeet Singh put some pressure on them today to try to push them to speak up against Trump, and that's going to put the Liberals in a difficult spot. But on Poilievre, I think this is the difference between naivete and realism. Realistic diplomacy understands that everything is a negotiation, You heard Poilievre already mention softwood lumber. He's already speaking up for some tough issues for Canadian industry, where you see Canadian industry getting gutted in BC around the softwood lumber dispute. And he's starting to lay his cards on the table and saying, look, if you want to negotiate with me when I become Prime Minister, I'm going to fight for Canadian jobs. I'm going to lay that marker down today. And that's a sign of strength. I think Trump will respond to that. I think I think he takes a similarly realistic approach to these kinds of relationships.
But Ginny, to be fair, I mean, the Trudeau government did do that during Trump 1.0. I think they handled the NAFTA negotiations, people would say, pretty well on that approach. And I'm not minimizing the impact of softwood lumber in any way, shape, or form. But the tariffs that Trump is talking about are going to cause an economic hemorrhaging that's going to make that look like a nosebleed. I mean, that's got to be job number one here, does it not? To find a way to be inside the tariff wall or mitigated from it entirely.
But why does Trump want to impose those tariffs? I think for the same reason that Harris did, and for the same reason that you saw Poilievre be the first person in Canada to suggest that we should apply some tariffs on certain Chinese goods, and that's because there are unfair state actors globally, namely China, who are making our free trade unfair and not free. And I think Poilievre knows that Trump is responding to that. And so, one, showing that Canada will do that too and not be a backdoor to those bad actors. Showing that Canada will also be tough and not allow our industry and our jobs to get sold out for the sake of scoring political points. And maybe find some common ground, like maybe find a way to say we have to create some exemptions, we have to friendshore, whatever you want to call it, because obviously our economies are so deeply integrated. And it's not just about jobs, it's also about consumers and the cost of their goods and trying to keep those costs down by having freer trade. Yeah, well, I mean, Jordan, the tariffs, I mean, there are some protectionist instincts and impulses in the Kamala Harris ideas as well, but nothing like what Donald Trump is suggesting here. So how do you approach this if you're the Liberals? Like Ginny said, pick a lane. There's the political lane, and then there's the governing lane. And the governing lane is find a way to deal with these tariffs. Yeah, that's right. And this is really a catch-22 for the Prime Minister, because there's going to be a lot of political pressure because there's capital in taking up the space of defending Canadian workers and Canadian jobs, and that's exactly why you saw Jagmeet Singh and Pierre Poilievre try to occupy that space today, because there are many fights to come on that front. But for the government, the politics of appeasement with Trudeau are going to have a lot of appeal. There is definitely concern about provoking him. He is not a rational actor. And that's what makes the politics of this so challenging, because you know, the idea that somehow he views Canada as an important and special relationship, I think, is not grounded in fact. We have not seen that from him in the past. And so the notion that we will be entitled to some sort of a carve-out just on the basis of that historic relationship, I think, is probably one that's not grounded in reality. So the Prime Minister has a tough road to walk here, and he's going to be receiving pressure from both sides to be much harder on Trump and to take a stronger stance, and probably a lot of advice to the contrary. Yeah, it's on that relationship. I think when Joe Biden won, Justin Trudeau was his first foreign leader call, and I still don't think the Prime Minister has spoken with the President-elect yet, or at least we have no public notification of this. So, Sherelle, the politics of what we saw here in the United States, as I said, I was at that Trump victory party. And, it was very heavily male. I'm not going to dispute that. And a lot of white males. But there were a lot of women there. There were immigrants there. There were some openly queer people there. And they didn't care about the democracy arguments, the abortion arguments, the character arguments. It was just cost, cost, cost. And they felt they were not being listened to by the people who hold power. That's a pretty stark warning to Canadian politicians as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's something that we've been, talking about, at least here with you, for months, if not years at this point, is that the Liberals haven't been able to connect with the average everyday Canadian voter. And that is why Pierre Poilievre has had such a massive leg up on this, because he's kept his messaging very focused in on the affordability crisis. So if the ballot box question for the Americans was, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? It doesn't really matter if the economy is doing well, which it is here in Canada. And it doesn't really matter if it's, outside forces that were changing things. And it doesn't really matter that inflation is down or that the interest rates are cut. If people are paying more for groceries, which they are, if they're paying more for everything, which they are because prices don't go back down, then they're going to say, well, I'm not doing better off, and let me look back and see who's been, presiding over that period of time. Oh, it's the previous, is the incumbent? Well, then that must be their fault. And if you manage to drive that message home, that regardless of what, the facts are, that it is this person's fault, that's going to be really difficult to change minds on when people have been so thoroughly told that this is not, that the next person coming up to the plate is going to change it. People want somebody to move the needle for them, and driving down the lane, running a very centrist campaign isn't going to be the winning strategy when people are tired of the status quo.
Yeah, Amanda, I was struck talking to people at the Trump party last night that they just see the tariffs as him standing up for them. You know what I mean? Like, it's obviously going to make things more expensive. Anybody who understands it, but they don't care. It's kind of the symbolism of it and what it says to them. And even though the economy here is the best in the world with really high productivity growth, about 4% unemployment, so essentially full employment, inflation has leveled off, but prices are still up. And that's the challenge that Harris ran into as part of the incumbent administration. I was listening to Chrystia Freeland today talking about macroeconomic indicators and foreign acquisitions of things as signs of economic health, and it just doesn't get to the core issues that Trump and his campaign were talking about with ordinary Americans.
For sure, and this is, I hope this becomes a bit of a playbook for our own election as we move forward, because this came down to such a messaging exercise. And the message that's much easier for people to consume is, how do I feel? How do I feel when I'm in the grocery store aisle? How do I feel when I'm at the pump? So when you're talking about macroeconomic indicators, you're losing how people just generally feel at home and the conversations that they're having with their neighbors and their friends. And I think that is what Trump's campaign was successfully able to do. Frankly, I think that's what Poilievre's let's call it campaign, has been successfully able to do, is really distill it down to affordability and how am I feeling right now. And we saw when we looked at the exit polls, what were the things that were driving or motivating Harris supporters? And it was democracy, and it was, the right to an abortion, and what was driving those Trump voters. And it was really around affordability and immigration. So understanding what motivating messages and policies are going to be driving the momentum in a campaign, fueling people, driving them to the polls is so critical. And speaking in plain language and communication that people can easily understand, absorb, and share, because that's what we're in. We're in these cycles, these digital cycles, where we're looking to easily share messages. And that could be around a dinner table, or it could be through your Instagram account.
Ginny, it struck me too, there was a fundamental misunderstanding of who the electorate was and what motivated them. Because we were talking to Democrats here all week, and they're like, if you see high turnout amongst women, that's good for Harris. If you see high Latino turnout, that's good for Harris. You saw both of those things, and they weren't good for Harris. They just made assumptions, and they were wrong.
Yeah, there's an out-of-touchness to this election and to other elections where we've seen incumbents go down. And I think it's not just about the economy. It's about institutions that are increasingly out of touch with regular people, particularly lower education people who are in a different cultural milieu than the people who run institutions, making choices that have bad impacts on those people. And then on top of that, telling them they're wrong. If they feel poor, no, you're really going to be okay. If you feel like crime's high, no, crime's going down. If you feel like your children are unsafe, if you feel like immigration's too high, you must be a racist. I think that adds insult to injury when people are already feeling broke, and they feel like on top of that, the institutions around Kamala Harris, the Democratic Party, and the establishment in the U.S. Are extra out of touch with that. And I think the Harris team thought, let's double down on that in the end, because we just need to motivate our base to get out. And if we just get out women, if we just get out people of color, we'll do okay. And they seriously misread that situation.
Yeah, Jordan, I met a Cuban man, a Cuban immigrant at the Trump crowd last night who says, I came to this country the right way. We need to crack down on the people coming here the wrong way, right? So you get this, people assume there's a monolithic nature to some of the votes. It's just not there. So quick last thoughts to you and Sherelle, and then we got to say goodbye.
Well, I think this election is an example of an axiom that a seasoned campaigner friend of mine always talks about, which is that people have very little belief these days that government can help them, but they have a lot of belief that government can hurt them in their lives. And I think that really that part of that realignment is what we're seeing here. This was not a campaign where big programs and big government was going to pull people out of their concerns about affordability. They needed somebody to speak to them at the level of their own household, and it didn't happen.
Sherelle?
I think the only other thing I would add is that, I mean, yes, everything that we talked about is true. You know, there was important ballot box questions. There are people feeling that they're not being heard, but we also can't dismiss the idea that, you know, people would, at the end of the day, rather vote for a convicted felon than a woman of color to lead the United States of America. And that is something that still needs a lot of work to overcome. And I don't know if, you know, it's going to be something that, you know, any party is going to figure out in the next couple of years.
Well, you know, American voters, you can argue they didn't know what they were getting in 2016 necessarily. You cannot make that argument today. They knew. How could they not? And you know, when he won in 2016, a lot of people would say that was an anomaly, that Trump was an outlier. Maybe we're learning now that Joe Biden was the anomaly and Joe Biden was the outlier, because look at the vote data. It is seismic in its movement. We'll talk about that another day. I want to thank you all for being here. Amanda Alvaro, Ginny Roth, Jordan Likeness, and Sherelle Levin. Thanks so much.